Some choices brand your soul like a red-hot iron, and 14-year-old Samuel Briggs was about to discover that watching your uncle murder the town sheriff burns deeper than any cattle brand ever could. The morning sun cut through the dusty air like a blade through worn leather, casting long shadows across the weathered planks of Calvary's main street. Samuel stood at the edge of the boardwalk, his thin frame silhouetted against the amber light that seemed to hold all the weight of the world within its golden embrace. His hands, calloused beyond his years from working the family ranch, gripped the rough-hewn posts that supported the general store's overhang, knuckles white as bleached bone against the splintered wood. The boy's eyes, dark as midnight water in a deep well, held secrets that no child should carry, burdens that aged his young face into something far older than his 14 summers would suggest. Behind him, the sounds of the awakening town drifted like smoke on the wind. The creak of wagon wheels, the soft lowing of cattle being driven to pasture, the measured footsteps of Sheriff Marcus Whitmore making his morning rounds. Samuel had known that sound all his life, the steady rhythm of the sheriff's boots against the wooden planks, a cadence that spoke of order and justice in a world that often knew neither. The sheriff was a good man. Everyone said so, with silver hair that caught the light like burnished metal and eyes that could see straight through to a person's soul. He had been the one to teach Samuel how to whittle, how to read the signs of an approaching storm, how to look a man in the eye and speak truth, even when truth was the hardest thing to bear. The boy's mother had died, birthing his younger sister 3 winters past, leaving behind a silence in their small ranch house that no amount of talking could fill. His father, broken by grief and whiskey, had retreated into himself like a wounded animal, seeking the darkest corner of its den. It was then that Samuel's uncle, Jake Briggs, had come to stay, bringing with him the promise of help with the ranch and the burden of his own demons. Uncle Jake was his father's younger brother, a man whose smile never quite reached his eyes and whose laughter held an edge sharp as a skinning knife. He was charming in the way that dangerous men often are, quick with a joke and quicker with his fists when the mood took him. Samuel had learned to read the signs of his uncle's moods like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. There were the good days when Jake would teach him card tricks and tell stories of far-off places, his voice warm as summer honey. But there were dark days too, when Jake's eyes would grow cold and distant, when he would disappear for hours and return with dust on his clothes and secrets buried deep in his weathered face. On those days, Samuel would find reasons to stay in the barn or out with the cattle, anywhere but in the house where the tension hung thick as morning fog. The ranch had been struggling even before his mother's death, the cattle thin from drought in the pastures, brown as old leather. His father spoke often of selling, of moving east where the land was greener and the memories less sharp, but something always held them back. Perhaps it was the weight of 3 generations of Briggs men who had worked the same hard ground, or perhaps it was simply that grief makes cowards of even the strongest men. Samuel understood this in the way that children who grow up too fast understand many things, not through words but through the ache in his chest that came with watching his father stare out at empty fields with eyes that had forgotten how to hope. Yesterday evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of rust and gold, Samuel had been returning from checking the water troughs in the south pasture when he heard voices carrying on the still air. Low, urgent voices coming from the abandoned cabin that sat like a broken tooth at the edge of their property. The cabin had belonged to old Pete Morrison, a prospector who had died the previous summer, leaving behind nothing but debts and the lingering smell of tobacco and failure. Samuel knew he should have ridden on, should have minded his own business as his father had always taught him, but something in the tone of those voices made him dismount and creep closer through the twilight shadows. Through a gap in the cabin's weathered boards, he saw his Uncle Jake standing with 2 men Samuel didn't recognize, hard-faced strangers with cold eyes and guns worn low on their hips. They were discussing something in voices too quiet for Samuel to fully understand, but he caught fragments that made his blood run cold. Words like next shipment and split the take and Whitmore's getting too close. The boy's heart hammered against his ribs like a caged bird as the terrible understanding settled over him like dust after a windstorm. His uncle, the man who had carved him wooden animals and taught him to play poker, was involved in something dark and dangerous, something that threatened the very foundations of the only world Samuel had ever known. But it was this morning that the world truly shattered like glass beneath a hammer's blow. Samuel had risen before dawn, as was his habit, to tend to the horses before the heat of the day made the work unbearable. The stable was cool and dim, filled with the comforting sounds of horses moving restlessly in their stalls and the sweet smell of hay and leather. He was measuring out oats when he heard the footsteps outside, different from the usual morning sounds of the ranch. These were quick, urgent steps, followed by the low murmur of voices he recognized. His Uncle Jake was talking to someone, their words carrying clearly through the thin morning air. "He knows too much," came his uncle's voice, tight with something that might have been fear or anger or both. "Whitmore's been asking questions, poking around where he don't belong. Someone's been talking. What do you want to do about it?" This was another voice, one of the strangers from the cabin, gravelly and cold as winter stones. "Same thing we always do about problems," Jake replied, and there was something in his tone that made Samuel's stomach clench like a fist. "Sheriff's got a routine. Every morning, same time, he walks from his office to the hotel for coffee, passes right by that alley between Morrison's old shop and the blacksmith." Samuel felt the world tilt beneath his feet like a ship in rough seas. They were talking about Sheriff Whitmore, the man who had been more of a father to him than his own grief-stricken sire in recent years. The boy pressed himself against the stable wall, hardly daring to breathe as the terrible conversation continued outside. "You sure about this, Jake? Killing a sheriff brings a lot of heat." "Already too much heat." His uncle's voice was flat, emotionless as winter ground. "Whitmore dies today, or we all hang tomorrow. Simple as that." The boy's world cracked open like an egg, spilling out everything he thought he knew about right and wrong, about family and loyalty, about the man who shared his blood and his last name. Samuel stood frozen in the stable's shadows as the voices moved away, his mind racing like a spooked horse. He could warn the sheriff, could run into town and tell him what he'd heard, but that would mean betraying his uncle, the only family he had left besides his broken father and baby sister. It would mean destroying what remained of the Briggs name in a town where reputation was everything, and shame followed a family for generations. The boy saddled his mare with trembling hands, his movements automatic from years of practice, while his mind churned with possibilities. He could ride hard for town, could reach Sheriff Whitmore before the appointed time, could save a good man's life with a few words. But those same words would damn his uncle, would bring the law down on their ranch like a summer storm, would leave his father and sister with nothing but scandal and ruin. The weight of the choice pressed down on Samuel's shoulders like a heavy yoke, bending his spine and aging his young face with lines that spoke of burdens no child should bear. As he rode toward town, the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, burning away the cool comfort of dawn and replacing it with heat that shimmered off the hard-packed earth like visible prayers. Each hoofbeat of his mare's steady gait seemed to echo with the rhythm of his racing heart, and Samuel found himself counting the beats like a funeral dirge. The town of Calvary spread before him like a miniature world, its buildings small and precise as carved figurines, its streets empty except for the early risers going about their morning business, with no knowledge of the darkness gathering in the shadows. Samuel guided his horse toward the main street, his eyes searching for the familiar figure of Sheriff Whitmore making his morning rounds. Time seemed to move like honey in winter, each moment stretched thin and precious, carrying with it the weight of decisions that could not be undone. The boy's hands were slick with sweat despite the morning chill, and his breath came in short, sharp gasps that had nothing to do with the ride and everything to do with the terrible knowledge burning in his chest like a coal from hell's own fire. The sheriff emerged from his office precisely on schedule, his silver hair catching the early light like a beacon of hope in a world gone suddenly dark. He walked with the measured stride of a man comfortable with his place in the world, unaware that death waited for him in the narrow space between two buildings where shadows gathered like conspirators and silence held the weight of ambush. Samuel watched from his position near the general store, his heart hammering against his ribs so hard he was certain everyone in town could hear it, as the good man who had been his teacher and friend walked unknowingly toward his doom. The alley between Morrison's old shop and the blacksmith stretched before Sheriff Whitmore like an open mouth, dark and hungry and waiting. Samuel could see the glint of metal in the shadows, could make out the shapes of men pressed against the weathered boards like spiders waiting for flies. His Uncle Jake stood among them, transformed from the man who had carved wooden horses into something cold and predatory, a stranger wearing a familiar face. The boy's throat closed tight as a noose as he realized that in seconds everything would change forever, that the world would lose a good man and gain another stain that would never wash clean. Time crystallized like frost on a window, each second sharp and clear and impossibly precious. Samuel could taste the dust in the air, could feel the sun's heat on his face, could hear the soft whisper of wind through the wooden buildings that lined the street like tombstones marking the graves of simpler times. Sheriff Whitmore was 3 steps from the alley, then 2, then 1, and still Samuel sat frozen on his horse like a statue carved from his own indecision and fear. The weight of choice pressed down on him until he could barely breathe, until the world seemed to narrow to this single moment that would define not just his future, but his very soul. A gunshot cracked through the morning air like thunder on a clear day, sharp and sudden and final as a judge's gavel. Sheriff Marcus Whitmore staggered out of the alley, his hand pressed to his chest where crimson bloomed across his white shirt like some terrible flower. His eyes, those kind eyes that had seen straight through to Samuel's soul, found the boy across the dusty street and held his gaze for one impossible moment. In that look, Samuel saw not accusation, but understanding, not anger, but a sad kind of forgiveness that cut deeper than any blade ever could. The sheriff fell to his knees in the dust, then pitched forward onto his face, his silver hair now matted with dirt and blood. The morning sounds of Calvary, the creaking wheels, the lowing cattle, the measured footsteps of daily life, continued unchanged, as if the world had not just lost one of its few remaining good men. Samuel felt something break inside his chest, something vital and irreplaceable, like a clock spring snapping under too much tension. His Uncle Jake emerged from the alley with the other men, their faces grim but satisfied, their eyes already moving past the sheriff's body toward whatever came next in their dark plans. Jake's gaze swept across the street and found Samuel sitting motionless on his mare, and for a moment uncle and nephew looked at each other across a distance that measured more than mere yards. In his uncle's eyes, Samuel saw a flicker of something that might have been regret or warning, or perhaps just the cold calculation of a man who had learned to survive by any means necessary. The men scattered like leaves before a harsh wind, disappearing into the maze of buildings and back alleys that honeycombed Calvary like passages in some vast underground tomb. Within minutes, there was nothing left to mark their presence except the sheriff's body lying in the dust and the terrible knowledge burning in Samuel's young heart like a brand. The boy sat his horse and watched as people began to gather around the fallen lawman, their voices rising in shock and dismay and righteous anger at this violation of their ordered world. Dr. Harrison knelt beside the sheriff's body, his weathered hands searching for signs of life that Samuel knew he would never find. The town's minister, Reverend Walsh, arrived with his Bible clutched to his chest like armor against the evil that had visited their peaceful streets. Women gathered their children close and spoke in hushed whispers about what kind of man would gun down a sheriff in broad daylight, about what this meant for the safety of decent folks trying to make honest lives in an increasingly dangerous world. Samuel remained mounted at the edge of the crowd, invisible in the way that children often are during adult crises, his eyes fixed on the sheriff's still form and his mind reeling with the weight of what he had witnessed. He was perhaps the only person in Calvary who knew the truth of what had happened, the only one who could name the killers and see justice done. But that same knowledge made him complicit in his uncle's crime, bound to the conspiracy by blood and silence, and the terrible understanding that speaking would destroy not just Jake, but everyone connected to the Briggs name. The territorial marshal would come, Samuel knew, drawn by the murder of a lawman like a hawk drawn to carrion. There would be questions and investigations and a slow, methodical hunt for the men responsible. The marshal was said to be a hard man, fair but relentless, the kind who would not rest until justice was served, regardless of who got hurt in the process. Samuel had never met him, but he had heard the stories, tales of criminals run to ground and hang from makeshift gallows, of justice meted out with the inexorable patience of a man who had seen too much evil to tolerate anymore. As the morning stretched toward noon and the crowd around the sheriff's body grew larger and more agitated, Samuel finally turned his mare away from the scene and rode slowly back toward the ranch. The familiar landscape rolled past him like scenes from someone else's life. The scrub brush and scattered rocks, the weathered fence posts and grazing cattle that had been the constants of his existence for as long as he could remember. But everything looked different now, tainted by the knowledge of what he carried, transformed from comfort to burden by the weight of terrible truth. The ranch house sat at the end of a long dirt road like a ship anchored in an ocean of brown grass and endless sky. It was a simple structure, built by Samuel's grandfather from timber hauled across two territories in dreams that seemed foolish now, in the harsh light of reality. His father would be inside, probably sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands, and his eyes fixed on some middle distance that held all his lost hopes and buried sorrows. His baby sister would be playing on the floor with the wooden blocks that Uncle Jake had carved for her, innocent of the darkness that had entered their world like poison seeping into a clean well. Samuel unsaddled his mare and turned her out to pasture, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he were performing some sacred ritual. The stable smelled of hay and leather and honest horse sweat, scents that had always meant safety and home, but now seemed as fragile as morning mist before the sun's harsh light. He stood for a long moment in the doorway, looking out at the familiar landscape and trying to reconcile the boy who had ridden out that morning with the one who had returned carrying the weight of a dead man's blood on his conscience. Uncle Jake returned to the ranch near sunset, his horse lathered with sweat and his face carefully neutral, as if this were just another ordinary day in an ordinary life. He nodded to Samuel as he unsaddled his mount, his eyes holding a warning as clear as words. This was the moment when the boy would either become his uncle's accomplice through silence or his enemy through truth, when the bonds of family would either protect a killer or be severed forever by the blade of justice. "Heard there was trouble in town," Jake said quietly, his voice carrying no more emotion than if he were commenting on the weather. "Sheriff's dead," Samuel replied, his own voice sounding strange and distant in his ears. "That's so. Wonder who'd do such a thing." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a funeral pyre, heavy with unspoken meaning and terrible understanding. Samuel met his uncle's eyes for a moment, seeing in them the cold calculation of a man who had crossed a line from which there could be no return. In that look, the boy read both threat and plea, both warning and desperate hope that blood would prove thicker than justice. "Don't rightly know," Samuel said finally, the lie tasting like ashes in his mouth. His uncle nodded slowly, as if some crucial negotiation had been completed to both parties' satisfaction. They finished their evening chores in silence, two figures moving through the familiar routines of ranch life, while the weight of shared secrets pressed down on them like the gathering darkness of approaching night. Inside the house, Samuel's father sat at the kitchen table exactly as the boy had imagined, his coffee cold and his eyes fixed on distances that stretched far beyond the walls of their simple home. He looked up when Samuel entered, his gaze flickering briefly to his son's face before returning to whatever visions held him captive in that private world of grief and whiskey-soaked regret. "Trouble in town today," his father said, his voice thick with the kind of weariness that comes from carrying too much sorrow for too long. "Yes, sir," Samuel replied, settling into his chair at the scarred wooden table that had served 3 generations of Briggs men. "Sheriff Whitmore's been killed." His father's eyes sharpened for a moment, the first sign of real engagement Samuel had seen in months. "Marcus is dead? How?" "Shot down in the street. Nobody knows who done it." The older man absorbed this news with the slow deliberation of someone who had learned not to expect good things from the world. He reached for his coffee cup with hands that trembled slightly, whether from grief or drink or simply the accumulated weight of too many disappointments, Samuel could not say. "He was a good man," his father said finally. "Better than most of us deserved." Samuel nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady. His baby sister gurgled happily from her place on the floor, oblivious to the adult concerns that swirled around her like storm clouds gathering for some terrible tempest. She had Uncle Jake's wooden blocks scattered around her, simple toys carved with love and skill by hands that had later held a gun and ended a good man's life. That night, Samuel lay in his narrow bed and listened to the sounds of the ranch settling into sleep around him. The wind sighed through the eaves like the breathing of some vast, patient creature, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called to its pack with a voice that spoke of wild places and wilder hungers. He could hear his uncle moving restlessly in the next room, the floorboards creaking under his weight as he paced like a caged animal. The boy wondered what dreams would come to a man who had killed in cold blood. What visions would haunt the darkness behind closed eyelids? Sleep, when it finally came, brought no peace. Samuel dreamed of Sheriff Whitmore falling again and again in the dusty street, his silver hair catching the morning light like some terrible beacon. He dreamed of his uncle's eyes, cold and calculating as a snake's, and of the marshal who would come with questions that cut like knives. He dreamed of his father's disappointed face when the truth finally emerged, and of his baby sister growing up with the stain of murder on the family name. The marshal arrived 3 days later, just as Samuel had known he would. Ezra Thornton was a tall, lean man with gray eyes that missed nothing and a mustache that had gone white at the edges from too many years under the relentless sun. He rode a black gelding and wore his authority like a well-tailored coat, comfortable and unassuming, but impossible to ignore. Samuel watched from the barn as the marshal approached the house, his movements economical and purposeful as a predator's. The boy's father emerged from the house to greet their visitor, his manner carefully neutral in the way of men who had learned not to trust authority too quickly. Uncle Jake appeared from the direction of the corral, his face pleasant and open, showing none of the tension that had marked his behavior since the sheriff's death. Samuel marveled at his uncle's ability to transform himself, to become the charming, helpful man that people expected to see, rather than the cold killer who had emerged from that alley. "Marshal Thornton," his father said, extending his hand in greeting. "What brings you out our way?" "Sheriff Whitmore's murder," the marshal replied, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "I'm talking to everyone in the territory, seeing what folks might know about it." "Terrible business," Jake said, shaking his head with what appeared to be genuine sorrow. "Marcus was a fine man. Can't imagine who'd want to hurt him." The marshal's gray eyes fixed on Jake with the intensity of a hawk studying prey. "That's what I aim to find out. Mind if I ask where you were yesterday morning, around 8 o'clock? "Right here on the ranch," Jake replied without hesitation, "fixing fence in the south pasture. Samuel can vouch for me. He saw me heading out that way at dawn." Samuel felt the marshal's attention shift to him like the beam of a lighthouse, bright and inescapable, and impossible to hide from. Those gray eyes seemed to look straight through to his soul, to read the secrets written there in letters of fire and blood. The boy's mouth went dry as desert sand, and his heart hammered against his ribs with the irregular rhythm of a broken clock. "That right, son?" the marshal asked, his voice gentle but carrying an undertone of steel. "You saw your uncle heading out to fix fence that morning?" The moment stretched between them like a rope pulled taut, ready to snap under the weight of truth or lies. Samuel could feel his uncle's eyes on him, could sense the desperate hope and veiled threat in that gaze. His father waited with the patient resignation of a man who expected the worst from life and was rarely disappointed. The marshal stood perfectly still, like a statue carved from judgment itself, waiting for the words that would either condemn an innocent man or set a killer free. Samuel opened his mouth, closed it again, opened it once more. The truth sat on his tongue like a coal from hell's own fire, burning him with its weight and necessity. He thought of Sheriff Whitmore's kind eyes, of the wooden animals his uncle had carved, of his baby sister playing innocently with blocks made by a murderer's hands. He thought of justice and family loyalty, of right and wrong, and the terrible gray spaces that existed between them, like shadows at twilight. In that stretched moment, Samuel Briggs aged a decade, his boyhood dying as surely as if it had been shot down in a dusty street. He looked into the marshal's gray eyes and saw not just a lawman, but the embodiment of everything that separated civilization from chaos, order from anarchy, justice from the rule of the strong over the weak. He thought of all the Sheriff Whitmores who would die if men like his uncle were allowed to escape the consequences of their actions, and of all the innocent people who would suffer while killers walked free among them. The boy's voice, when it finally came, was steady and clear as mountain water, carrying with it the weight of a choice that would echo through the rest of his days, like the sound of church bells on a quiet Sunday morning. "No, sir," Samuel said, meeting the marshal's eyes without flinching. "I never saw Uncle Jake that morning. Matter of fact, I saw him riding toward town just before sunrise. Him and two other men I didn't recognize. They were talking about Sheriff Whitmore, about how he'd been asking too many questions about something they called the next shipment. The silence that followed was absolute, as if the entire world had stopped breathing to listen to the boy's words. Samuel felt his uncle's shock and rage like a physical force, felt his father's confusion and dawning horror, felt the marshal's satisfaction as cold and clean as winter air. The truth hung in the space between them like smoke from a signal fire, impossible to call back and impossible to ignore. Marshal Thornton nodded slowly, as if Samuel had confirmed something he had already suspected. His hand moved to rest casually on the butt of his gun, and his gray eyes never left Jake's face as the older man's pleasant mask finally slipped away to reveal the killer beneath. "Jacob Briggs," the marshal said in a voice that carried the weight of final judgment. "I'm arresting you for the murder of Sheriff Marcus Whitmore." Jake's hand dropped toward his gun, but the marshal was faster, his Colt clearing leather with the smooth precision of long practice. The two men faced each other across the dusty yard like figures in some ancient morality play, one representing justice and the other the chaos that justice existed to contain. "Don't make this harder than it has to be, Jake," the marshal said quietly. "The boys told me what I needed to know. You're done running." For a moment, Samuel thought his uncle might try to draw anyway, might choose to die in a blaze of gunfire rather than face the hangman's noose. But something in the marshal's eyes, some implacable certainty that brooked no resistance, seemed to drain the fight out of Jake like water from a broken barrel. His shoulders sagged in defeat, and he slowly raised his hands above his head. "You little bastard," Jake said, his voice thick with venom and betrayal. "You just killed your own family." Samuel met his uncle's furious gaze without flinching, though the words cut him deeper than any knife ever could. "No, sir," he replied, his voice steady despite the tears that threatened to spill from his eyes. "You did that when you murdered Sheriff Whitmore." The marshal bound Jake's hands with practiced efficiency, then helped the defeated man onto his horse. As they prepared to leave for town and the territorial jail, Thornton turned back to Samuel with something that might have been respect flickering in those implacable gray eyes. "You did the right thing, son," he said quietly. "I know it wasn't easy." Samuel nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady. The right thing felt like swallowing broken glass, like carrying a weight that would never grow lighter no matter how many years passed. But as he watched the marshal lead his uncle away toward whatever justice awaited him, the boy felt something else stirring in his chest alongside the grief and guilt. It was a small thing, fragile as a newborn bird, but it was real and it was his own. It was the knowledge that when faced with the hardest choice of his young life, he had chosen to stand with the angels rather than the demons, with justice rather than blood, with the memory of a good man who had deserved better than to die in a dusty alley at the hands of those who should have protected him. The sun was setting by the time the marshal and his prisoner disappeared over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to promise both ending and beginning. Samuel stood in the yard of his family's ranch and watched them go, knowing that his world had changed forever, but not yet understanding all the ways that change would shape the man he would become. His father emerged from the house, his face aged by shock and grief and the terrible understanding of what their family name would mean in Calvary from this day forward. The older man placed a gentle hand on Samuel's shoulder, a touch that conveyed both forgiveness and gratitude without the need for words. "We'll get through this," his father said quietly, his voice stronger than it had been in months. "We'll carry the shame, but we'll carry the pride too. Pride in knowing we chose right when it mattered most." Samuel nodded, leaning into his father's touch like a plant turning toward the sun. In the distance, a coyote called to its pack, its voice carrying across the empty land like a hymn to all the wild and untamed things that existed beyond the reach of human law and human justice. But here, in this place where 3 generations of Briggs men had worked the hard ground and tried to live decent lives, justice had been served by the steady voice of a 14-year-old boy who had learned that some choices define not just our actions, but our souls. The stars emerged one by one in the darkening sky, distant lights that had watched over countless human dramas of courage and cowardice, love and betrayal, justice and mercy. Samuel looked up at them and felt the weight of his choice settling into his bones like the ache of old wounds, but also felt the first stirrings of peace. Sheriff Marcus Whitmore was dead, but his killer would face the consequences of that choice. The boy had spoken truth when truth was the hardest thing to speak, and in doing so had perhaps redeemed not just his own soul, but the honor of the Briggs name itself. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new choices, new tests of the character that had been forged in the crucible of this terrible day. But tonight, as the wind sighed through the eaves of the ranch house and his baby sister slept peacefully in her crib, Samuel Briggs stood at the threshold between boyhood and manhood, marked by the knowledge that he had faced the darkness and emerged not unscarred, but unbroken. If you enjoyed this incredible tale from the frontier, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories from the American West. Click on the video on the screen for another tale we think you will love.